There is a window in your city that is lying to you. It looks like glass, it functions like glass, but if you stand at the right angle, in the right light, and look through it instead of at it, the world on the other side bends slightly, wavers. The straight edge of a building across the street develops a slow curve. A vertical line leans for a moment, then rights itself. That distortion is not a flaw. It is a signature. The man who made that glass left it there, not on purpose, not by accident, because there was no other way to make glass by hand without leaving that mark, and the mark has been there for 100 years, waiting for someone to notice it. Most people never do. Glass is older than civilization. Obsidian, volcanic glass formed when molten rock meets cold air, was being shaped into cutting tools by human hands at least 700,000 years ago. The first manufactured glass, sand and ash fused by heat into something new, appears in the archaeological record in Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. Beads first, then vessels, then, slowly, over centuries of accumulated knowledge, something flat. The Romans understood that glass could be made into sheets. They poured molten glass onto flat stone surfaces and ground it smooth. The results were thick, uneven, difficult to see through clearly, but they were windows. The idea that a building could have an opening that let in light while keeping out weather was Roman, and it was radical. When Rome fell, the knowledge of how to make flat glass did not disappear. It retreated into the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks who understood that light was sacred kept the craft alive in the colored windows of the churches they built. By the 11th century, glassmakers in Venice had developed something the Romans never had, a method for making flat glass not by pouring, but by blowing. And that method, refined over 8 centuries, is still being used today in a factory in Lamberts, Germany. The man who changed everything about flat glass was not an architect or an engineer. He was a glassblower named Angelo Barovier, working on the Venetian island of Murano in the mid-15th century. Barovier did not invent glassblowing. That technique had existed for over 1,000 years. What Barovier and the Murano craftsmen systematized was the application of blowing to flat glass production. The method they developed, which spread from Venice across Europe over the next 2 centuries, was called the crown glass process. Here is what it demanded. A glassblower gathered molten glass on the end of a long iron pipe. He blew steadily, rotating the pipe continuously, expanding the gather into a sphere. Then he transferred the sphere to a solid iron rod called a pontil, attached at the point opposite the blowpipe. He reheated the piece, and spinning the pontil rapidly, used centrifugal force to open the sphere outward. The spinning mass of molten glass flattened and widened into a disc, sometimes 4 feet across, with a characteristic bullseye thickening at the center where the pontil had been attached. That disc was the glass. Cut into panes, it produced windows with the slight optical distortion that came from the uneven thickness of a spun disc. The center bullseye, the thickest and most distorted section, was the cheapest grade. The outer sections, thinner and clearer, commanded higher prices. The bullseye panes you see in the windows of old taverns and coaching inns in England and New England were not decorative choices. They were the affordable option, the glass nobody else wanted. A master glassblower could produce perhaps a dozen discs in a working day. Each one required complete physical coordination, the breathing, the rotation, the heat management, the timing of the centrifugal spin. It calibrated not to a machine specification, but to the behavior of that specific gather of molten glass on that specific blow. No 2 discs were identical. No machine has ever replicated the process. By the 17th century, a second method had developed alongside crown glass. It was called the cylinder or muff process, and it produced larger, flatter panes with less distortion. A glassblower gathered a larger mass of molten glass and blew it into an elongated cylinder, sometimes 3 feet long and 6 inches across. He rotated continuously while blowing, keeping the walls of the cylinder even. Then he cut off the ends, scored the cylinder lengthwise with a diamond, and placed it in a flattening oven. The heat softened the glass, and the cylinder unrolled under its own weight into a flat sheet. The skill required was different from crown glass, but no less demanding. The cylinder had to be blown to a consistent wall thickness, or the flattening would produce waves and distortions. The scoring had to be precise, or the cylinder cracked instead of unrolling. The flattening oven had to be held at exactly the right temperature, hot enough to soften without melting, cool enough to flatten without flowing. A master cylinder blower named Johann Lucas Pilkington, working in England in the early 19th century, could produce cylinders of such consistent quality that his glass was specified by name in architectural contracts. His glass is still in the windows of buildings constructed during his working lifetime. You can identify it by the slight horizontal banding that runs across the pane, the ghost of the cylinder's rotation, preserved in the cooled glass like a fingerprint in stone. In 1848, a French engineer named Henri Bessemer, the same man who would later transform the steel industry, filed a patent for a process to cast and roll flat glass mechanically. The glass industry looked at it and continued blowing. Not because Bessemer's process failed, because the glass it produced was different. Mechanically cast and rolled glass had a surface that was flat to specification but dead. It transmitted light without quality. The slight variations in hand-blown glass, the gentle distortions, the way it caught light at different angles and returned it differently, were not imperfections the industry was eager to engineer away. The customers who could afford the best glass knew the difference. But the customers who could not afford the best glass were more numerous, and the factories that could produce flat glass mechanically, at speed, at volume, at a price no hand blower could match, were already being built. By 1900, machine-made flat glass was standard in new construction across Europe and America. By 1920, the hand cylinder process had largely disappeared from commercial production. By 1950, a craftsman who could blow a proper cylinder of flat glass was a specialist employed by a handful of restoration workshops serving clients who needed replacement glass for historic buildings. The skill that had kept light inside human structures for 8 centuries had been made commercially irrelevant in 50 years. In the town of Waldsassen in Bavaria, Germany, a glassworks called Lamberts has been producing hand-blown window glass continuously since 1906. It is the last factory of its kind operating at commercial scale anywhere in the world. The craftsmen at Lamberts still use the cylinder process, still gather molten glass on iron pipes, still blow and rotate and cut and flatten in the same sequence that Johann Lucas Pilkington used in the early 19th century. The glass they produce is specified by architects and conservators restoring historic buildings across Europe and America. Westminster Abbey, the Palace of Versailles, the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. When a window in a medieval cathedral needs a replacement pane, the specification often calls for Lamberts glass, because it is the only glass made today that optically matches what was made 500 years ago. The factory employs fewer than 50 craftsmen. Each one serves an apprenticeship measured in years before being trusted with production work. The knowledge of how to read a gather of molten glass, how to feel the rotation in your hands and know from the resistance whether the wall is thickening unevenly, how to time the centrifugal spin of the crown disc to the exact moment when the glass is plastic enough to open but not so fluid that it flows, that knowledge is not written in any manual. It exists in the hands of the people who have it. When those people retire, the knowledge retires with them unless the apprentice standing next to them has absorbed it completely. The factory at Lamberts is not a museum. It is a living workshop producing glass that architects need and machines cannot make. But it is also the last one. Here is what machine glass cannot do. Float glass, the method invented by Alastair Pilkington in 1959, produces flat glass of extraordinary optical clarity by floating molten glass on a bed of molten tin. The result is perfectly flat, perfectly consistent, perfectly transparent. It is also optically inert. Light passes through float glass and arrives on the other side unchanged. The glass adds nothing, takes nothing away. It is a transparent barrier, which is precisely what modern architecture requires. Hand-blown glass does something different. The slight variations in thickness that come from the blowing process, the gentle waviness, the occasional seed bubble trapped in the wall, the faint rotation marks from the cylinder, interact with light the way a still water surface interacts with light. The image on the other side moves slightly, breathes, changes as you move. Conservators and architects working on historic buildings describe this quality with a specific phrase. They call it life in the glass. Float glass has no life, it has clarity. In the windows of buildings constructed before 1920, in the old courthouses and churches and farmhouses that still have their original glazing, you can see the difference the moment you look for it. The world through those windows is slightly in motion. The glass is doing something that glass made after 1960 does not do. It is holding the breath of the man who made it. The glassblowers of Murano kept their craft secret for 3 centuries by order of the Venetian Republic. In 1291, the Republic ordered all glassmakers to relocate to the island of Murano. Officially for fire safety reasons, the furnaces were a hazard in the city. The real reason was control. On Murano, the craftsmen could be watched. Their knowledge could be contained. A glassblower who attempted to leave Venice and take his craft to a foreign power faced a specific legal consequence. The Council of 10, Venice's security body, was authorized to send agents to find him and bring him back. If he refused to return, the agents were authorized to kill his family members who remained in Venice. The knowledge was that valuable. Glassblowers who stayed were granted privileges unavailable to other Venetian craftsmen. Their daughters could marry into the nobility. They received legal protections that other tradesmen did not have. The Republic understood that the knowledge in a craftsman's hands was a strategic resource, not the recipe for the glass. The recipe was simple sand, ash, heat. The resource was the ability to execute, the 10,000 hours of practice that turned a gather of molten glass into a flat disk of consistent thickness. That ability could not be written down. It could not be stolen in a document. It could only be carried in a human body that had done the work long enough to know it without thinking. When the last Murano glassblower who knew a specific technique retired without passing it on, that technique was gone, not suppressed, not hidden, gone, because the only place it existed was in him. There is an old building near you. It might be a church, a courthouse, a farmhouse on the edge of town that has been standing since before anyone alive can remember. A row of Victorian shopfronts on a street that survived whatever replaced the neighborhood around it. Find a window that is original, not replaced, not restored with modern glass, original. Stand close to it, put your eye near the glass and look through it at something with a straight edge, a doorframe across the street, a roofline, a telephone pole. If the glass is hand-blown, the straight edge will not be perfectly straight. It will bend slightly as your eye moves across the pane. The world on the other side will shift. That shift is the breath of the man who made it, the rotation of his hands, the timing of his blow, the specific moment he chose to stop spinning and let the disc cool. He has been dead for 100 years. His hands are still in that glass. The skill that made it is almost gone. The factory in Waldsassen is still running. But there are fewer than 50 craftsmen left who know how. When the last one retires, the windows of every cathedral and courthouse and farmhouse that still holds original glass will become irreplaceable in a way they are not quite yet. Not because the glass will break, because no one will know how to make what replaces it. Find an old window near you and look through it the way this video described. Tell me in the comments what you saw.